Okay, I think we're good to go now. Sorry about the delay this evening. We've had, I think we're okay to go. Apologies about this. Uh, Garrod O'Coleman and I have tried over the course of this week to speak several times about Notre Dame, but for whatever reason, we have not been successful to do so. But we've managed to sort out whatever glitches were happening in the connection over the last hour and 15 minutes. So tonight, as I said, the theme of our conversation is going to be we're looking at all of the holes, all of the questions, all of the inconsistencies coming out in regard to the Notre Dame fire. But we're also going to be looking a little bit at Freemasonry and, the connections therein, and also the New World Order. Now, I'm going to say that I am so delighted to see how many people appear to be waking up. The number of people who are saying to me in recent days alone that they feel there's something very sinister going on in Ireland, in Europe, in the world. They look into the skies, they don't understand what's going on, but they're starting to ask questions. They're looking at all of the Catholic churches being burnt and vandalized at the moment, and silence from the mainstream media, and how the Notre Dame story is being spun. And I just get a really strong sense that there is an awakening. But tonight we are going to go quite deep into this. So for the red-pilled among you, you will find this very interesting. For those of you who are not so far down the rabbit hole as we are, you might find it a little bit technical in that, but the Garrod O'Coleman, who's been living in Paris for more than a decade, is an absolute expert when it comes to Freemasonry, George Soros, the clash of civilization, and what really everything that we're looking at, and just saying we are heading into probably the scariest time in history in many ways, and we're living in it. And anyone who doesn't believe that now has their head stuck in Coronation Street. But Garrod, thanks. Sorry about the long introduction. You can hear me okay?
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Gemma. First of all, I have to say I'm not an expert. I mean, the more I learn, the more I realize how ignorant I am. I mean, it's just things I learn every day. I'm not an expert, but I'm good at probably putting things together and synthesizing and extrapolating from that. I think that's
Garrod, can I just ask, where are you from in Ireland originally?
Cork.
You're from Cork. I should have known that from the accent. Yeah, but you've been in France and you're working as a journalist, and your website, garrodocoleman.com, is well worth a look. .org, my apologies, .org. So for anyone, when we're finished this evening, they might like to read up on some of his excellent work, particularly in relation to the person that I believe is the most dangerous man on the planet, George Soros. But there are many others, but he's my personal favourite, or least favourite. Garrod, we were talking there about just the stream of stories coming out of Notre Dame, now not from the mainstream, but from people who actually seek the truth. And one that just struck me there was how 3 hives of bees that were living in the roof of the cathedral managed to survive. And you immediately saw something quite interesting in that. What was that?
Well, I only found this out recently, but apparently bees, you see a lot of beehives in Masonic imagery. And the meaning of the beehive, the reason why the beehive is favored by a lot of lodges, is because the beehive represents the hive mind. So in a beehive, you have, first of all of the bees, the male bees, the drones, are dispensable, and they serve the goddess. So you have the idea of the earth goddess and the hive mind. And it seems that for Masonry, this is sort of the ideal. So you have, one order, one world, with a sort of a goddess at the center. And of course, the feminization of men, it's very symbolic. Men are just sort of dispensable tools of this sort of, goddess figure at the center of it. A lot of this subversion of opposites happens in Masonry, because the ideal of Masonry essentially is the hermaphrodite. Because what it attempts to do is to subvert the natural relation that exists between a man and a woman. So, the myth, story, whatever you want to call it, of Adam and Eve, where man is created first and woman is created from, a rib of the man, according to the Bible, is subverted. And the idea is that by joining the female and male principles into one, they can bring about the Messiah. They can bring about the sort of connection with the beyond. This is a sort of Masonic mythology. So a lot of that is deeply significant. It's bizarre. I didn't know about the beehive story.
That story has
how significant it was.
Yeah, that story has just come out, and it is yet another fascinating insight. And of course, the reason why we're talking about the Masonic order is because those of us who believe that globalism is the greatest curse on mankind and our planet at the moment believe that most globalist institutions were infiltrated by the Masons. Over and above everything else, they have infiltrated the Catholic Church, Islam, Judaism. They are the core infiltrators, and we know that when people get to a certain level of Freemasonry, they have to spit on the Bible or decide, are they going to start committing acts of evil as well as acts of good. Now, I am a novice. I'm not going to claim any insights, but I want to try and keep it as, down to earth as well as possible, so that we don't lose people. But so we are connecting these incidents that we've been seeing, but we're, looking at the New World Order, which is what the Masonic globalist cult are trying to implement. They want war, they want chaos, because they're saying is chaos, order out of chaos. So all of the chaos we see all around us at the moment, the sickness, the geoengineering, the breakdown of borders, mass immigration, cultures coming together, has all been brought about by this globalist cult. So Gearóid, just getting back to Notre Dame, some of the things that have struck me, and then I let you talk. One of the chief architects involved in the renovations has said that the 1,200 oak trees that were in the roof, which burned, he believes that they could not have burned because they were so old. He does not understand how the fire took hold of them so quickly. He's basically shaking his head in an interview, and this is a very experienced man. And they're currently saying the latest is that a computer glitch caused the fire. And people are just saying, no, sorry, we're not buying it. Gearóid, over to you.
Benjamin Mouton is his name. He's former chief architect until 2013. And, in a very interesting interview, he basically said that, he was stupefy, as he said, flabbergasted, couldn't understand how this could happen. He said you would need an enormous fuse, an enormous explosion, essentially, to cause a fire like that. And he just doesn't see how that was possible, because they took the electricity out of there. And it was very heavily guarded. The wood came from the forest outside Paris. They basically cut down one tree for every beam. It's very, very, very old wood. It was already 400 years old when they cut it down in the 12th century. So, this goes right back to Charlemagne. This goes right back to these trees that were growing when the French state was in its infancy. So he said that even the wood itself, even if there was a big blaze or explosion or something like that, that it wouldn't take fire very easily. Now, what amazed me as soon as I saw the pictures of the fire is just the extent of it, and the celerity of the flames. I mean, it was a really major fire, and the first question I asked myself was, where were the security? I mean, I would have thought it would be pretty easy to isolate, a fire like that, because they have measures to deal with that. I mean, it's the big we're supposed to be in a war of terrorism, with threats everywhere. You have they have this thing in France called Vigipirate, which is you see these pyramids basically stuck everywhere on every door, called Vigipirate, saying terror threat, terror alert. you know. So, and like Notre Dame is the most symbolic, and it's the most important building in France in terms of tourism and heritage and everything. And I just, when I saw the flames, the extent of it, I thought, well, it must have been an explosion or something, because I don't see, even an electricity would have to have been, would imagine would have to be some kind of explosion, gas explosion, something really big to get that kind of a flame going. And the response seems to have been very slow, you know.
Well, it was 35 minutes before the fire brigade arrived. And I mean, it is your, like, as you have said, I mean, Notre Dame, if we think of the most famous iconic building in France, it is Notre Dame after the Eiffel Tower. And given the very tense mood and atmosphere, not only in France, but across Europe and in the UK and Ireland at the moment, it's just not credible that they do not have proper security there, and that, you know, the alarms would not have rung immediately. Like, you know, we're not being told the facts. It's not, the story they're putting out is not credible.
It's not credible at all. Look, this is a nuclear power. I mean, it's a nuclear power. It's a world power. They have highly sophisticated technology. This is not a banana republic, you know. It's just not credible. And the amount of security in France is unbelievable. I mean, there's police everywhere. I mean, and of course, you know, this was a prime target, and they've known that for years. So it's not credible that they wouldn't have you know, backup teams that could be there in 2 minutes, right in the center of Paris, and it takes them all, you know, that length of time. So some significant things have turned up since, you know. You have one report I've seen on Panam's Info, which is a good website. Can't confirm it, but apparently an Israeli was arrested on site, behaving suspiciously, and we don't have much more information about that. But as I've mentioned many times, after 9/11, dozens of Israelis were arrested in the United States and were subsequently released. Now, some of the Israelis who were arrested actually with explosives on that day, and they were subsequently released, and nobody knows why. There was never any explanation, but it's, I think, significant and worrying that the media are not talking about this. Of course, then you also have the video, which was validated by Agence France-Presse, of somebody on the roof of the building an hour and a half before the fire. And it has been validated as an authentic video by Agence France-Presse. And you see a flash. You see a flash going off. And Agence France-Presse said it proves nothing. You know, but, you know, as I said in my article, well, it proves that somebody was on the roof an hour and a half before the attack and a flash went off. That's what it proves.
Okay, yeah, like, I mean, this is so important what you're saying, because any of us who've seen these pictures of the man in the balcony, you know, you're just shaking your head in disbelief at this. And to look at him, he you know, he's reminiscent of, well, we won't say, but, you know, just look at that video. And, you know, as Agence France-Presse has said, this proves nothing, but as you say, it proves that a man was on the balcony prior to the fire, and that there was what was it described as, a flame?
A flame, a flash.
A flash.
So obviously we need to know who this guy is, and I presume the police are investigating, and we'll know pretty soon who he is. It's just, you know. That we should know by now. We should know by now, because there are security cameras everywhere in Paris. Everywhere, you know.
Everywhere.
You cannot climb up onto the roof of the most important cathedral in Europe, in the middle of Paris, and not be seen. You know, it's just not credible.
And, you know, they were trying to imply that this was a fire officer, but that the timing is out, and well, I'm not sure is the timing out, because I'm. Well,
the thing about it is, Gemma, that, you know, we have to be careful with we have to be extremely careful with information, because I believe there is foul play. It's the first thing I said. You know, this is foul play, but I don't know how it happened. I don't know who did it, and the big problem can have is that because we're in an information war, that video, for example, it could actually be fake video. In other words, it could be something put out there which, for which there is a simple explanation, like he may have been a worker, they may have got some information wrong, and it could be just a false lead. It could easily be there to mislead people, because the way the media work here is that they have this war on conspiracy theorists and anybody who asks any questions, and so this could be a trap. But,
of course, and then, like, when I first looked at that video, I'd said to myself, this looks like a setup, because to look at it at the person, you immediately think he looks like a Muslim cleric, the way he's dressed. He sort of has a look of Osama bin Laden about him. So I immediately thought this is a setup. And the video will be proven.
I thought it was fake news.
The video will be proven fake, and any of us who are asking questions deeper than the mainstream will be set up. And this is what they're doing. This is what they're doing, and they're more than capable of doing it.
And they are. I mean, they have specialized teams in disinformation and psychological warfare. Scott Bennett, a friend of mine, who worked with Edward Snowden, in the psychological operations teams. I mean, their job was to design psychological operations scenarios, and Scott Bennett, I did a lecture tour with him in Iran, and just listening to him talking about how the military in the United States work at that level in terms of organizing scenarios, war games, information warfare. Sometimes you might get 90% of the truth, and then 10% will mislead you. And there's all kinds of traps, and it's just part of standard military training now in the information era. So it is very hard to know what is authentic, what isn't. You have to be very, very careful.
The one good test that I find works is that when you put something out that you believe is a possibility, and that's what journalists should do, the amount of trolling that you get on a certain point, if you get an awful lot of trolling, it means you're on the right track. Because the things they really don't want you to know about are the ones that they will heavily troll you on. And people say to me, "Oh, Gemma, you're being trolled so heavily." I'm like, great, it means I'm above target. I love to see intense trolling on a certain tweet or video or Facebook post, because it means I'm on the right track.
That's true, yeah. So to come back to the war on terror, what does this mean? Well, I think it was highly significant that you had an attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I mentioned that in my last talk with you. The Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. And I'm almost sure, and I would ask your listeners to do their own research, but I'm almost sure it was the exact same moment, like almost the exact same moment, at least. And so you had a fire there. Now there wasn't too much media coverage about it, but there was a fire confirmed in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, Israelis have not made any secret about the fact that they want to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They talk openly about wanting to remove the mosque, which is based in a temple. Now, for people who may not be familiar with what all this means, this is key to understanding Masonry, because the mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, is built on what is believed to be the ruins or the site of Solomon's temple. Without getting too much into biblical mythology or history or whatever you want to call it, Solomon, built a temple in the ancient world, which was believed to be, I think, around the 9th century, which was believed to be the one of the wonders of the ancient world. And the temple was destroyed in 70 AD by Titus, by the Roman Empire. That dispersed the Jews from the Middle East, and that was kind of they were dispersed throughout the nations from that moment on. And in Masonry, it's a key it's a key element to the mystique, because Masonry is essentially Gnosticism. But it's a sort of a syncretic religion. In other words,
you should explain that, will you? Explain that to our listeners.
It's composed of heresies. The church, since its foundation, let's just say the very easiest way to explain Masonry is it's conspiracy against the Catholic Church. That's what it is. And the first thing, if I was researching Masonry and I didn't know what it was, I would go to the authorities. You know, forget the conspiracy theory. Don't go to the internet, because there's a lot of rubbish about this on the internet, and everybody's got his own view, and 90% of them are wrong. Go to the Catholic Church. Go to Rome. Go to the encyclicals. Read what the popes say about Freemasonry. Whatever you think of the popes, they were not idiots. And when they sent these encyclicals out, they sent them all over the world to every single Catholic parish in the world. So if you go back a century in Ireland, you take Catholic intellectuals in Ireland. I can mention, for example, Father Dennis Fahey. I don't know if he's very well known in Ireland. I didn't know anything about him. I discovered him here in French translation. He's very popular in France. He wrote books about this around, I think it was around the early part of the 20th century. And one of his books was approved by the Pope as a good, you know, as a good introduction to the New World Order, actually. So if anybody asked me, you know, what's a good introduction to the New World Order, I'd say read Dennis Fahey's books, and you'll know what the New World Order is a century ago. In other words, the Catholic Church has been talking about the New World Order for centuries. The only reason why mainstream Catholics, let's say in Ireland, France, and all over the world, don't know about it is because the Catholic Church is run by Masonry itself. Now, if you read the encyclicals of Leo XIII, I would urge people to read those first. Forget everything else on the internet. Just go to the documents, go to the actual documents and read them. Then, you know, he wrote more encyclicals about Masonry than any other pope. And, you know, it's almost at, you know, there are some encyclicals where he's basically saying, you know, he's crying for help. He's basically saying Masonry is already in the church. And he's saying this is a cancer that is going to bring Christendom to an end. And the church was, you know, was very, very clear that this was Satanist. This was a syncretic movement. In other words, it's composed of different elements. It's composed of all the elements that were rejected by Catholicism. So you've got, you know, Gnosticism, you know, different kind of movements and in the Catholic Church, like different heresies that came from the Middle East, plus a lot of pagan religions as well, mystery religions, which are mostly sort of matriarchal, the idea of the goddess, for example. So in the Old Testament, you know, you see Astarte. She's known in Greek as Astarte, and in the Old Testament, Ashina is one of the pagan gods. And one of the things that happened to Solomon, King Solomon, is that he was, you know, originally he was the son of David, and he had a dream, and God asked him in the dream, "What do you want?" And he said, "I want wisdom." And God was delighted, you know, that he wanted wisdom. So he said, "You know, that's great. I'll give you more. I'll give you wealth as well." And he ruled over his kingdom for a very long time. And then what happened was he basically formed marriages with different kingdoms, pagan kingdoms, and had over 700 wives and concubines. You know, so hundreds of wives and concubines. And basically, he fell out of favor with God. So a lot of people believe that in the temple that he built, which was meant to be the temple to God, and that many people believe that they were basically pagan symbols. So you would have had, you know, symbols of Ashina and Moloch. Moloch was an ancient god in the Bible, you know, which people were basically, it was a god which required child sacrifice. And so, you know, in the Bible, you have a lot of barbarous people, you know, the Canaanites and the Jebusites and all these people were supposed to have practiced child ritual murder, you know, like child sacrificing. Moloch was one of those gods. So you have Moloch, Baal, Ashina, and all these pagan gods. They're all sort of earth cults, you know. Mm-hmm. So for centuries, the church warned people about this. And
one person who I have a great fondness for, and there's great affection for him among Irish Catholics, is Padre Pio. And he was very, very, he stood up against the Freemasons, and this was, you know, part of his mission
Absolutely.
and I think he said that Masonry had reached the Pope's slippers.
There is a book in
but-
French. I haven't read it yet, but apparently there is a book in French by Laurent Glosy. He's a very good researcher, and he claims that Padre Pio was murdered. I don't know. I haven't researched it yet, but I don't know if there's any research on that anywhere else. But would make sense.
It would make sense, because that was his. He pleaded and pleaded with people to stand up to the Masons and to warn them that the church had been infested. So that's another, because there is huge devotion still to Padre Pio in obviously in Italy and France, Spain, and in Ireland, all of the great Catholic countries of Europe, Poland.
Sure.
Sorry.
The thing about France is that I think that from what I've seen, the best research in Masonry is French. They have some fantastic theologians here and biblical scholars, and I find that a lot of the research on Masonry that you find in the English-speaking world comes from Protestant sources. And the big problem with that is that if you go to the chief hall of the Masons in London, it's also the center of the World Evangelical Organization. And so a lot of these evangelical churches are just, they're all Masonic in structure. People in Ireland should be able to understand this very easily, because in Ireland we have the Orange Order, but the Orange Order is actually not as bad as Masonry, because at least they march out in the street and you can see them. And they kind of, but the Orange Order is a Masonic organization. It has a Masonic structure, and they've admitted that themselves, And again, the Protestants, I think this is not intentional either. A lot of the scholars of Mason, people that talk about Masonry, they tend to be Americans or British, and they tend to come from the Protestant or evangelical tradition, and they just don't get the bigger picture. And that's the difference between France and Britain. The French are better at philosophy, they're better at critical thinking, they have a global perspective on things. You just don't find that in the English-speaking world. And the English, I've seen the Protestants who talk about it, they basically try to say that it's some kind of Catholic conspiracy. And this is, I think, is reason why you talk about Masonry gives you a bad name, because it kind of gets ridiculous if you think it's the Catholic Church. It's just they're
an anti-Catholic cult,
and so it's the idea of and the problem there as well is that, yes, of course, the Catholic Church is run right now by very evil people. I think we don't really realize just how evil they are. For example, just looking at the Notre Dame, the aftermath of Notre Dame, there was the big question we have to ask about that is, what bishops, what priests may have been involved in this, because a lot of them are Masons, And I listened to the Bishop of Paris, Monsignor Petit, and I have to admit, I listened to the whole interview, and I just thought, he's very cool. He's very cool about this. He's kind of very matter of fact. I would have thought some kind of, listen, you compare that to, some of the traditional priests I know here, and I mean, they have tears in their eyes. I mean, you could see the emotion. They see this as, I'm talking to people like Abbe Pages, wonderful priest, written books about Islam. He has a huge mission to convert the Muslims, and he has been converting Muslims every day. And he talks about this in world historical terms. You listen to the Bishop of Paris, and he's like, we need to be nice and calm, and everything's fine. There was no theology. There was no sense of
So true.
No criticism of the current order. And I think that these are the things to look out for in clergy. How critical are they of the system,
Yes, very, very true. And I saw there earlier today how a statue of Our Lady in the Loire region was decapitated. We know that there was a similar thing happened in, there was a beheading of a statue of the Virgin in LA a couple of weeks ago. I mean, this is happening on a regular basis, but of course, the mainstream media are just ignoring it. But just getting back to Notre Dame, sorry to interrupt you, Gareth, like, you know, what they do always with these attacks as well is there's the distraction. So first of all, they find, you know, the hero of the day, and there's always a hero, and there was in this case. But also then they're talking all about the reconstruction, and so many people are utterly repulsed at the billions being offered by these awful globalist companies who have nothing to do with Roman Catholicism or Catholicism, and they want to jump on the bandwagon, and that's sort of become the story, rather than hold on a minute, what actually happened here, what caused this attack, what caused it, and you know, these are the questions. But it's all about, wow, look at all this money coming in.
Sure. I mentioned that in my article, which people can read on my website, Rabbinic Church Burning and the Parrhesia of Christ. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I was kind of trying to get, I guess, the deeper philosophical sense of what's going on in that article. And so it's kind of, there's a lot of practical information there, and there's kind of more philosophical reflections as well on the deeper meaning, as far as the way I see it. But
well, the point I'm trying to make there, Gareth, is that they always they want, look over here, look over, this is what we want you to look at the donations, look at the hero, rather than the facts.
The point I was going to make about that was that, you know, and I made it in the article, was that culture, the idea of culture, has replaced grace. And I got this from this idea, I thought it was really interesting observation, with Spanish philosopher Gustavo Bueno, and he had a brilliant essay about this, where he said, you know, that grace was something that you required through the sacrament of the church, through education, until the Enlightenment. But after Enlightenment, with the values of the Enlightenment, which of course was deeply Masonic, the whole Enlightenment movement was not an Enlightenment at all. It really was just a redirection. But you have this idea of culture, and culture becomes a kind of almost an entity in itself. And the point I tried to make was that, you know, you see that today. In other words, churches are empty. There's no more, you know, people aren't going to mass. People aren't genuflecting. They're not going there to venerate Christ. They're going there to enjoy culture. So there are, you know, classical concerts on there, and it's wonderful. I mean, it's better than nothing. But it's also a kind of idealization of culture. Culture now becomes an idol in itself, and this is what you're seeing here. The billionaires, you know, the oligarchs are, you know, kind of, you know, restoring culture, and so by doing that, they legitimize themselves and they legitimize the state. Macron also is now the savior of culture, and of course, the Masons have called for, you know, they said. One of their tweets, they want to reconstruct the temple. They refer to the church as the temple, and so, you know, they have a good sense of humor. I give them that. But, you know, you mentioned decapitated statues. This, I may be reading too much into this, but I just find it strange that the Restoration people, they took out the 12 apostles, statues of the 12 apostles, which were on the church. For restoration, and they decapitated all of them to remove them. You know, it may be standard procedure. I haven't researched it. It may be a normal thing, but it's kind of symbolic. You know, because in the era when decapitation itself is being made very banal in our culture, we see this on the television, ISIS and decapitation. Decapitation is back. And it's become something that, you know, we hear about all the time. And, you know, without getting too deep into this, you know, people should research the Noahide laws, because I've written about this. The Noahide laws, that's what's coming. That's when you get a world government, you won't have world religions anymore. But what you will have is Noahism, and that comes from Masonry. Noahism is based on the Talmud, and basically what you get is God, a ruling elite, it's the Talmudic elite, and ruling over everyone else. And again, that's being discussed in the United Nations at the highest level. I gave a paper on this at a conference in Tehran last year And even people there who are very well informed, because obviously Iran has huge problems with Israel, and I don't need to tell people about that. Even a lot of people there were quite surprised. They had never heard of the Noahide laws. They're officially law in the United States since 1991. And they, rabbis, which I mentioned in the article, the extremist rabbis, are pushing this as a new form of world religion, form the legal basis for world religion. 7 Noahide laws. So this is actually quite advanced, and nobody's talking about it, but it is spreading like wildfire in the Philippines, in a lot of third world countries right now. And there have been conferences in the UN, and they've managed to get people to sign up. Yes, we should make the 7 laws the laws of a world civilization. And this is the Talmud. Now, when one of the things that the 7 Noahide laws says is that the idolatry should not be tolerated. Now, in Judaism and Islam, idolatry is the Trinity. The Trinity is idolatry. Idolatry for them, it's polytheism. So they describe our religion as polytheism. And so, under the Noahide laws, I guess the Wahhabi Muslims, the terrorist nutcases from Saudi Arabia, and other countries in the Middle East, people in the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a Masonic organization, they will have their place within the Noahide laws, but the chief target will be Christians, because they would be seen as idolaters. So in that article, I quoted many rabbis in Israel applauding the burning of the church, saying that churches in Israel should be burnt, and they have been burnt. Christians have been kicked out of the Middle East. Not just Israel, but Syria, all over the Middle East, as everyone knows. Church is doing nothing about it. Rome never says anything. You won't learn anything about this in the Catholic media. So this is the big problem. Catholics are not informed. They're not informed about what's happening.
They're not. And when I've been talking to a lot of people this week about, did you know that in France up to 3 churches are vandalized every day? And people are, what? And when you tell them that, it's a game changer. Because let us not forget, because the media would like us to forget this, but let us not forget that in 2016, when Irish people signed up to the census, 78.3% of them said that they were Catholic, despite everything that the Masonic media have tried to do to destroy Christianity and Catholicism in Ireland. That is how many people put down the fact that they were still Catholic. Now, if they didn't have to put that down. They chose to put that down. And that is still 80% in 2016. That is incredibly encouraging, because people are still holding on to their faith, which in my opinion is the most important thing you can have as a human being to get you through life. But just getting back to the decapitation, I mean, I think, okay, so what people think when they think of decapitation, they think of, this has, it seems like this could be ISIS or some sort of Islamic terrorist act. And what they are clearly trying to do, I mean, if there have been predictions of a third world war. First World War was about, getting rid of the monarchies, getting the royalty out of Europe. Then the Second World War was about the creation of Israel and all of the trouble that would bring upon us. And then I'm not necessarily giving a position there on the state of Israel, because I'm not going to do that. But let's face it, it has been extremely. I'm looking at some images of Gaza this evening, and look, it's it has not been without its difficulties. But is the Third World War about pitting, which is probably coming our way? Is it about pitting Muslims against Christians, fueled by the Masonic order? This appears to be what it is about, that they are doing everything they can to set Muslims against Christians.
I would say absolutely. I've been saying this for years and years. This goes back to Samuel Huntington's idea of the clash of civilizations. And it was the idea that there's an incommensurability or an incompatibility between Muslim civilization and Christian civilization, and that they would inevitably clash. This, you only have to ask yourself the question: why do we have allies like Saudi Arabia? Women get decapitated in public squares in Saudi Arabia. Everybody knows that. They have an appalling human rights record, and yet the United States, France, Britain, all the big powers send them weapons. They bomb the hell out of Yemen. They've committed genocide there. There are 500,000 children starving to death. It's one of the worst genocides in modern history. There are some people talking about it in the media saying, should we be doing this? Should we be murdering kids in Yemen? But generally, nobody stops it. The Saudi regime is a monstrosity. It's a monster, and they've been sending terrorists into Syria for the last 7-8 years. I was in Syria 2 weeks after the war started there, and I could see footage of the Muslim Brotherhood terrorists shooting protesters dead. They shot 8 police in the first few days. There was nothing in the West. That's how the war started. They shot police. And when I went around Syria at that time, you could still travel around the country, and I went to about 7 or 8 cities. I arrived in Hama one day, and a bomb had just gone off, and they were complaining about Assad. They were saying that Assad is not sending in the troops. He said he's not strong enough. We want tanks in the street. We want troops. There's terrorists everywhere. You see what they were talking about in the media, what they were saying. And when I was there, I remember in the hotel I was talking to a businessman and his family, and we were watching the BBC. The whole idea that Syria censors information is ridiculous. I was on Facebook. I was reading the New York Times and Le Monde. I was watching the BBC, and they showed images, fake images from the war in Iraq of soldiers torturing someone. And I remember the guy said to me, he said, he looked at the BBC. He didn't know whether it was true or not. He said, if that's true, we don't support that, But you could see that they were being kind of just traumatized by the information. They were changing channels all the time. They were going to Al Jazeera and they'd see something else, and you hear people talking about it. And, people were being manipulated by the media. A lot of people I met there were so brainwashed by Western media that they were ultimately supporting Al-Qaeda. They were praising Al-Qaeda, And if you want to talk about anti-Semitism, people talk about, I'm constantly defending the Jews. My whole work is about defending the Jews. People call me anti-Semitic. If you heard what these guys were saying, these terrorist nutcases, it was just appalling. I met them there. They were nice, but in a very kind of say nice in the sense of they were kind of nice people, but they sort of had a very warped view of the world. The warped view of the world was coming from the Western media. Is it any surprise that we have terrorism? But people need to understand that there isn't a war on terrorism, and there never has been a war on terrorism. There is a war of terrorism against the people of the world, and that's what's been happening, for a very long time. And it's
if we had any leadership, Gareth, in on the continent in Europe, several years ago, they would have said, look, this is not working. Open borders is not working. Islam is not compatible with Western values. It's causing our citizens, we had a safe, Europe was relatively safe and stable, and now we have non-stop terrorist attacks. And they would have said, we're closing our borders. It's becoming unsafe for our citizens. And this is not what Europe is about. But they didn't do that. They said, borders are open and Muslims will get absolutely top priority, preferential treatment. I mean, I was reading some stories today, like there is a very shocking video coming out of Denmark showing police bundling an activist into a van after he was attacked by Muslims for throwing a Quran in the air. Now, you see, the thing about Europe is that we are supposed to be allowed to do things like that. And goodness knows Christianity is insulted every single day of the week. But as Christians, we allow this because we have free speech, and we want people to be able to express their feelings, as long as they don't engage in violence. But it's very important for people to have full freedom of expression. And so when somebody behaves in this way, there was a time in Europe that that person's right to throw a Quran or the Talmud or the Bible into the air, that they would have been allowed to do that. But now they're arrested and thrown into prison because Islam, or whatever Islam is in Europe, it's Masonic, whatever it is, you know, given absolute priority and superiority over Christians and indigenous Europeans.
It's interesting, you know, my friend, I have a co-host, and we do a radio show together every month in France's biggest political website. It's the most important website, I think, right now in France. The media hate us. They're, you know, Alain Soral is probably the most well-known intellectual in France. He set up this website called Égalité et Réconciliation. We do a show every month with on geopolitics mostly. And Youssef Indy's his name, is from Morocco, and he's written many books on Islam. Call him an Islamologist, really. He's an expert on Islam and Masonry, particularly Islam and Masonry and these Masonic structures. And it's all over the Muslim world. The Muslim Brotherhood, you know, is a Masonic organization. And so the reason why Muslims are being brought in en masse into Europe is because they're being brought in by their friends in the lodges. These are oligarchs. These are business oligarchs. These are millionaires, you know, in the Middle East. For example, in the Arab Spring, and I've written a lot about this, about the Arab Spring, and big problem when so-called revolutions happen, the left get very excited, start jumping up and down, and think, you know, this is going to be a great people's revolution. And, you know, sometimes that does happen, like the Yellow Vests, but then when you get the Yellow Vests revolution, the left don't seem to be interested at all in that, but they're very interested in Arabs getting excited and throwing stones at police. When the Arab Spring happened, it had been organized by the United States since 2004, and it was announced by Condoleezza Rice, the former U.S. Secretary of State, in front of AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. She announced more or less the Arab Spring in 2005. She said there's only two democracies in the Middle East: US-occupied Iraq and Israeli-occupied, she said, so-called Israeli-occupied Palestine. The point she was making is the US and Israelis need to take over the Middle East, and the way we're going to do it is we're going to do it through revolutions. Revolutions coming to town. So the first place Obama went to in 2008 when he was elected president was Egypt, and that's what he said. Change is coming to town. So he went to Egypt, and they were all, you know, we love you, Obama, you're so great. And he had all the cheerleaders there. All of the U.S. agencies, and they have many. You have the Albert Einstein Institute. You have the Canvas, the Center for Applied Nonviolent Actions and Strategies, based in Serbia. They were all on the ground. They had been working there since 2005 in these countries in North Africa, creating so-called democracy programs, which were really just regime change programs, because the United States had put the secular regimes there in power during the Cold War. So they supported, they didn't support Nasser. Nasser was a nationalist, but they had an agreement kind of with him, and he was kind of halfway road between the Soviet Union and the United States. But after Nasser, they put in Sadat in Egypt. He was a CIA agent, so he ran Egypt on behalf of the CIA. And when you get a leader who's working for the CIA, what he does is he gets the country into debt. So Sadat got the country into massive debt with the IMF. You know, that created real, genuine social problems. Mubarak was helped into power after that. He was less compliant than Sadat. And the US had a huge problem with him for years, because the Egyptian military were refusing to cooperate with the US on anti-terrorism operations to do with Palestine and Israel and so on, because they see Israel as the main enemy there. And so they needed to get rid of Mubarak. So from 2004 to 2011, the US organized all these regime change operations in the United States, got rid of stable countries that were advancing at very rapid rates, about 10% growth in Mubarak's Egypt, in spite of the problems, massive growth in Libya under Gaddafi, even Tunisia. under Ben Ali, and he was put in power by the CIA in 1988. Even in Tunisia under Ben Ali, it was actually very successful. They had the highest success rate in the world in poverty reduction. The point I'm making is all of this chaos that the US created in the Middle East was provoked. They provoked it, and they saw what they could see from their own, because the US is not a banana republic. The US is the most sophisticated empire in history. They have brilliant academics, brilliant tacticians. The Pentagon is a sophisticated institute, and they have PhDs in everything. And one of the things they could predict 10 years ago, 20 years ago, was that demographic explosion in Africa, and that the regimes that were working and cooperating with the US in Africa, particularly North Africa, would have a problem of surplus population, surplus youth. And if they did not change the regimes, the surplus youth would overthrow those regimes and create regimes hostile to US capitalist interests. In other words, you've got 20-30% unemployed youth. You could get a regime that would close up those economies, and suddenly all the US capitalists and the oligarchs are excluded. So they needed to create a strategy. So they looked at Europe. Europe has demographic decline, cultural decline, decadent, so on and so forth. All of that has been engineered for a very long time. And so they thought, okay, so we just get one population and transfer them from one continent to the other and create a flow, And that's basically what's been happening. So if people want to get proof of that, they just need to read the books of General Thomas Barnett, former chief strategist of the Pentagon. He talks about it very clearly in his two books, Pentagon's New Map and I can't even think of the second book now, but I quote them in my articles, and they're very interesting because he talks about the 5 flows of globalization. I made that point before. Free flow of goods, money, energy, and so on around the world to create essentially a one world system, integrated system, and that's so it's the reason why Ireland is having population replacement is because, well, if you get a whole load of foreigners in Ireland, it means there'll be nobody running the country. There'll be nobody running the country. There won't be any Irish people there, and they won't have any sense of identity.
Patriotism, vested interest.
Of course, and
so obvious.
It's extremely cynical, because what's happening here in France is that the way the political parties work is you have the Front National is sort of the realist party, but they're very much there's a lot of Masons running that party as well, particularly recently. And it was never a good party anyway, the National Front in France.
No.
But they're sort of like the voice of reason or the voice of reality. So they kind of say very obvious things like we can't have immigration forever, and and Marine Le Pen will criticize things like the Middle East. They've changed their name now, but so you have the so-called far right, and their job is basically kind of say, look, we need to stop immigration and so on. Then you have the left party, which is basically says to the immigrant communities in the suburbs of Paris, we'll protect you from the National Front, right? We'll give you benefits. We'll make sure, we'll maintain social housing, things like that. We can't offer you employment because there isn't any. But if you vote for us, we'll protect you from the National Front. So they kind of tried to make people from the immigrant communities believe that the National Front's a racist party, is going to attack them. They're all going to be skinheads and beating them up and Nazis. And so they manipulate both sides, right? So the electoral, district of the left is the immigrant community, because they're basically the parties work as like the mafia, right? We'll give you security, right? You give us votes, we'll give you security, we'll protect you from the far right. And so this is the way it's working in Europe. And so and
it's to be fair, it's working like that. I mean, in Ireland too, because every single party in Dáil Éireann will put the migrant communities first, ahead of the local indigenous Irish people. I mean, we've seen how our Taoiseach, who's not my Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, you know, has implied that immigrants work harder than Irish people. And again, it's not because they give a toss about immigrants, it's because they are trying to create the friction between you know, they want to create all sorts of divisions, and that's why they've brought these people in the first place. But you know, what I've been saying to people is that these elections coming up, the locals, the Europeans at the end of May, and next year hopefully a Dáil election, these are the game changer elections. Next time around it will be too late, because we will then be heading into minority territory, you know, so that's why it's so critical for people to get out and vote now if they still want Irish people to have a say and a control over their own destiny and their country. And it's you see what is happening in France there, and it's the exact same here. And the reason why the Islamic community are so aligned to the hard left is because they're both supporting a communist ideology, total control, submission, and you know, where people sort of give up their rights very easily. They're not, you know, supportive of free speech.
You know, interestingly, there's a book by another French author called Droite et gauche, c'est pas fini. Left and right, it's not over. I forget his name now, but you know, he explains in that book that leftism, the left itself, comes from Gnosticism. It comes from, again, to come back to what we were talking about, Masonry and Gnosticism, which is a sort of perversion of natural law. And you know, like a man and woman, Adam and Eve, you pervert it and you create the hermaphrodite, which is neither, you know, transgender. This is where the transgender obsession is coming from. There's a mystique of trans, this idea of this fusion of male and female. And in that book, you know, he makes the point that the origin of the left, as we know it, the reason why they're called the left is because, you know, in Christian theology, you have, you know, Jesus is the right-hand side, he's on the right-hand side of God, right? So there's a sort of a, you know, primordial geography in terms of, you know, who's right or left, you know, and God is on the right-hand side. So he sits on the right-hand side. And that's why when you had the division between right and left after the French Revolution between the aristocracy, supported the king, they were on the right, and, you know, the Republicans supported the left, were on the left. But, you know, obviously, very important point here that must be made about the left is that, you know, workers' struggles were supported by the left when nobody else was supporting them. And that is extremely important. As, you know, miners achieved rights and better living conditions because of left-wing agitation and struggle. So I'm not trying to dismiss that, but if you look at it kind of conceptually, it does go back to Gnosticism. And so you see why the way in which globalization has been kind of progressing since the 1960s is through the left, but not supporting the worker, not supporting the wage earner, not supporting the working class, but using the working class, manipulating the working class's despair and grievances, but in particular pushing what they call in French, they call it la gauche sociétale, the social, the societal left. That's LGBT, or I should say LGBTQXYZ, as I usually say. You know, all these issues that have nothing to do with the struggle between labor and capital, you know, which was what the traditional, which was communists stood for in the 1950s, 1960s. Now they're not interested in the struggle between labor and capital anymore. They're more interested in gender and all this kind of stuff.
And as I often
pushing that on kids, in particular in the schools.
Oh, don't even talk about it. Yeah, should we have drag queen story time? But
that's the Gnostic element that's, you know, it's emerging here. It really is. It goes back to ancient heresies in the Catholic Church, and you understand when you read that, you understand why when heresies happened in the development of Christianity, you understand how serious they were, because heresy, if it spread, it was like a disease, it was a cancer, the whole thing could fall. And people might think, oh, well, didn't they have other ideas and shouldn't they be allowed? Yes, of course, but you know, in Christendom, the the reason why the church survived is that it basically it had an extremely rational structure, and so it could apply that rational structure to every counter hypothesis and refute it. That's why they created the universities. It was to actually bring that to perfection. And the universities were not meant to be places where they studied theology as such at all. I mean, it was science. We're constantly told that, the Catholic Church is anti-science. It's wrong, absolutely wrong. Modern science is a creation of the Catholic Church. All of the modern theories of science come from the Catholic Church, and that is one of the most detrimental things that has happened in the last 400 years. This idea that there's a conflict with reason. These people have evidently no knowledge of the history of Europe. And so because these heresies spread, the reason I made that, because you mentioned the Islamo-leftist alliance. And why is there an Islamo-leftist alliance? It's because Islam is also a Christian heresy. If you read John of Damascus, it's a good authority, father of the church, on Islam, he says it's a heresy, essentially. So Islam is a Christian heresy, and because it's a Christian heresy, it's basically similar to leftism, right? It sits on the left.
Yeah.
In other words, everything that's not on the right, and I'm not right wing. I don't even know what right wing is. I mean, I hate Margaret Thatcher, and that's what I consider right wing, right? I mean, or the European Union is right wing. I would consider them to be right wing, but I don't want to get into
globalists. They're just globalists. But I think the point we're trying to make, Gareth, is just to bring us back to the beginning of this, is that we're trying to make the point that there's some serious infiltration going on. Talking about the so-called left, if the traditional left were always against migration because it drove wages down and it was damaging, it was harmful for Indigenous workers, especially the working class. But these unions, as has happened in Ireland, they've all been infiltrated and captured. Everything that is set up. There have been attempts to infiltrate my new organization. I see them nearly, every week, and I'm very, very in tune with people trying to, because I've had to become like this. But they say in Ireland, for example, when you set up a new organization, the first item on the agenda is the split. And so everything is infiltrated. Look at the man who you've done huge research on, George Soros. He is in everything in Ireland that he can get into. He's in the Irish nurses and
He's subverting every single state in Africa.
subverting everything. And so, when we look at these lunatic organizations that are associated with him, who just, people just shake their heads and say, these men are bonkers. He's subverting democracy.
Sure. The thing about Soros and the ruling class, I was reading the history of a very interesting cooperative movement in Spain called the Mondragon Foundation, and it's most successful cooperative in modern history. It's one of the biggest employers in Spain, and it's never fired anyone. They're not allowed to fire anyone, and they have cooperatives everywhere. And when one cooperative gets into trouble, it helps out. They help each other out. They have it's a very successful social model, and it was developed in Spain in the early parts of the 20th century, and it took off during the Franco period. And the irony of this is that a lot of the left actually are interested in the Mondragon Foundation because it's pro-worker. But when the Franco regime in Spain, because the Franco regime was protectionist, it was a corporatist system. They had protections, and actually the Mondragon Corporation was their model. It was one of the models of Francoism. So it's fascist. I keep making this joke that the left are actually looking for fascism, but to explain what I mean is that the interesting thing about that corporation is that workers participate. They have an assembly in it, and it's very democratic. You have absolute security for life. It's a job for life. They have a university for training. It's very integrated. You know, it's widely considered to be one of the most successful cooperatives in the world. It's definitely something you should look into. And it thrived under the Franco regime because that was basically what Franco was trying to implement. The reason why Franco was trying to implement that kind of system is that that's actually based on Catholic social teaching, which is corporatism, which is class collaboration. And interestingly, in Spain, when they started to have problems in the Mondragon Corporation, it was just when the Franco regime was basically taken over by neoliberal economics around the 1960s. They got these technocrats in, Opus Dei and all these guys. And they were just only interested in making money and profit. And so it was only that point that they actually had problem in the cooperative, because the capitalists, they wanted the unions back. They had gotten rid of the unions. What they had created instead were national syndicates. And that was sort of like the pre-capitalist corporatist system. It's based on, you know, your government was if you were a carpenter, you'd be, you know, in a carpentry guild. They were very democratic structures. You had an awful lot more autonomy. But the ruling class, as they were getting richer, they got corrupt in Spain, and they wanted the unions back. The reason why they wanted the unions is because they could manipulate the unions and their so-called bargaining, you know, and they could manipulate the unions and they could make more profit with class struggle. So it's the point is the ruling class want class struggle. Workers don't want struggle at all. They just want jobs, security, family, you know, some peace. And am I going to have a house? Am I going to have a job? Do I, you know? I mean, working class people they don't want to run the doll. I mean, who the hell would want to run government anyway? I mean, it's not a job people want to do. People just want to make a living, you know? So it was the ruling class in Spain who wanted the unions back because they could get more money with the union system. It's very telling. It's very interesting. You know, you can see how the class struggle model, the way it is now, it's structured to favor the elites, and they're in bed with the elites. You see them here during the Yellow Vest protest. The left have no interest in the Yellow Vests whatsoever. It's hilarious. Like they still
have nothing in common with them,
and they've no interest in working class movements.
That says it all, doesn't it? That because the Yellow Vests are standing up for workers, for ordinary French people, and the left hate them. They despise them, and I noticed that. They hate their guts, and because they're standing up to globalism, and the left are globalists. But I noticed that the Yellow Vests have actually called for international experts to be brought in to examine what actually happened to Notre Dame, because they don't trust the situation. You were saying that you saw the wife of Macron there out on her bike there recently, and your interpretation of
people
this
will give out to me. It was the one occasion when I didn't have my phone with me, and
this is the woman who abused him when he was.
And I just turned around and there she was, and I discovered subsequently that Macron was doing that kind of thing as well, just sort of, you know, turning up in bars and going out to restaurants and sort of being seen there as part of a new drive to become popular, basically. So
it's very, very clever. I mean, an event like this can unify a nation as 9/11.
Yeah, because when it is effective. You see, you know, you're walking down the street and there's Brigitte Macron, and you know, she's just cycling on a bike. Obviously, she's got a few bodyguards with her, but people are going to see that and say,
of course, she's getting good brownie points on the climate change as well out on her bike. But of course, this is the woman who sexually abused her student Macron when he was 15. Isn't that right? Sure. She was his teacher, and you know, many people believe because of the fact that he was sexually abused as a boy by his teacher, who he went on to marry, you know, he is a narcissist and a psychopath as a result of that, and is able to carry out the appalling abuse of French citizens' rights without any concern for them, and it does, you know, is one of the major puppets, obviously, of this globalist criminal banking cabal. Of course, he went on he was a poster boy of the Rothschilds as well.
He worked for the Rothschild Bank, and one of the one of his employers said in an interview that, you know, he's one of his great talents was storytelling. And he admitted, well, because storytelling basically involves manipulating the public, right? Just telling him stories. And Macron is very good at that. He's a good storyteller. He's a bright spark. He knows how to manage an audience. You know, he's a good performer. So that's why. Then he's young, you know. But there's an element of there's definitely an element of social subversion there with, you know, the fact that Brigitte Macron, this relationship, this bizarre relationship that they have, and the fact that he was a child in school. And I think this is also part of, you know, this attempt to transgress in terms of age limits, sexualization of children, etc., etc.
Yes.
And I think,
yes.
you know,
completely.
also, you know, he just seems like a kind of I don't know. There's something really empty about him.
But it's like so many of the leaders in Europe at the moment and the world, you know, and then these very strange relationships, marital relationships and arrangements that they have, and no children, and, you know, it's all very, very. It's like they're actors. It's like they have, and we know that the Democrats actually have, you know, they take some of their new members from acting school. So it is just like they're all acting. And what worries me in Ireland is that they're, you know, the sleeping Irish look at Varadkar and they think, oh yeah, he's quite cool, he's quite trendy, and sure, he's great. And that is really, really disturbing, that there are people who think like that and don't see the bigger picture, you know, because these guys they come across as you know, quite trendy and smooth.
I think that one of the things, because we mentioned Islam, we mentioned the Muslims, and there are also contradictions that can happen, you know, and ways in which potentially dangerous situations can be turned around for the better. We mentioned, for example, you know, earlier we were talking about you know, Notre Dame cathedral, you know, that could sort of revive you know, Christendom. It could be the spark that kind of wakes people up, because most people in France don't believe, and from what I gathered, most people think that it was arson, you know. So I think because, you know, this is really goes to the heart of French people. So even people who are not religious, you know, were in tears, because it's just sort of so symbolic, you know. But so a bad situation could be kind of turned around. And one of the things that I've noticed with Muslim immigrants in Europe is that one of the very good things is, number one, they're religious. They have a religious, you know, sentiment. They support family values, even if sometimes they have a polygamous. Not all of them, but, you know, they're obviously this different interpretation of family. But they do have a belief. You know, they do believe in God, and they do also oppose a lot of the sexual perversion that the elites are pushing in the West. So, for example, in Britain recently, Muslims stopped teaching of LGBT to children in a school there. They just said, no way.
In Birmingham, they did.
Yeah, and it's, you know, people in Ireland should be aware of that as well.
Well, the one thing you can say about them, you know, whether you utterly disagree with their religion, culture, whatever, they do seem to stand up for it, which is more than a lot of Irish people are doing at the moment. So, you know, and this apathy and tolerance is as I say, they are the final virtues.
Muslim world is very diverse, because, you know, when I go to Iran, you know, I'll be talking to Tehran actually after this tonight, and they're so open-minded. They want to hear everything you have to say, and they study Europe, and, you know, they're very aware of how Europeans feel about immigration. A lot of my friends in Iran and officials I've spoken to, say, we don't support mass immigration to Europe at all. We want Muslims to stay in their countries and build them up into strong countries. So they know that Soros is behind it. So there are lots of the Iranians, of course, are very, very savvy. They're very well educated. The researchers there are second to none. You know, they study the West very closely. So it's very hard to fool them. You know, the British have been trying for a long time. I published an article there recently about Hassan Abbasi. He's one of the chief strategic figures in Iran, and I interviewed him a few times. And he said, he looked at me, he said, the British, they think they can manipulate anyone. He said they've got this MI6 Shia now. He said, and they're trying to pump that into Iran. He said, they never learn. He said, they've got all these, these bearded nutcases that they're pushing in front of the cameras, and they're doing all kinds of operations. But Iran is fairly, that's why, by the way, Iran recently, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps were put on the terror list. They're now terrorists. So we can't go to conferences there now because we might be put on the list as terrorists as well. So that's what happened. I mean, those conferences are interesting because, I met an awful lot of people from all over the world who were, and we were, I was challenged by that, because I had to meet people with different points of view. And, that was an NGO. And the guy who's made it, Nader Talebzadeh, he's one of the best known film directors in Iran. And he made a film called Messiah in 2007, which is about the Muslim view of Jesus. And it's very, very important that people in the West understand that, Islam recognizes Christ, recognizes the Virgin Mary. Sometimes they're far more interested in it and more appreciative of it than people in the West. Iranians were always asking about Christianity when I was there. It's like, what about the Virgin Mary? And we love Mary, and we love Jesus, and we were waiting for Jesus to come back. This is interesting about the difference between Shia Islam and the Wahhabis, because the Wahhabis, they don't allow Christianity in Saudi Arabia. So the best friends of the West don't allow Islam. They don't allow Christianity. Whereas in Iran, I went to many churches there. The Armenians are loved. They're very appreciated. They have deputies in the parliament there. You can't convert. That's Islam, right? It's not liberal. But that's their problem. The way I look at it is, that kind of Shia Islam under Iranian and Hezbollah direction is very interested in dialogue with Christianity. And their kind of slogan is they want Christ to come back, but they think Christ will come back with the Mahdi. The Mahdi is their 12th occulted imam, and they think that he's in the world, he's going to come back. And that's kind of their version of the Messiah of the end times eschatology. But it's something that's very compatible in terms of a working relationship, because they believe Jesus Christ was just a prophet, but they don't believe he was God. But we're fine with that, right? I mean, when they come back, I'm sure we'll work out who's who, and I'm sure. Yeah,
no. Well, some of us might be fine with it, but some of us are not fine with it. So I think we need to be very, very clear on that. But listen, I'm going to.
The point I'm making is that strategically, that's something that people need to understand, that strategically that can work in terms of, you can have a dialogue relationship. When I meet Muslims, I don't say, your religion is correct. I say it's false, because for me it's false. The whole ecumenism thing is the opposite of that. It's to say that your religion, like that's what the Pope is saying, right? He's saying Islam is true and Christianity is true. It's not, either one is true or the other is false. Can't have, because they're trying to create syncretic structure. That's what the Pope was trying to do, But the Iranians, the point is that all the Islamic countries have this. The Iranians, obviously, their biggest enemy are the Wahhabis, and the Wahhabis are supported by MI6, the CIA, the West, and they're wreaking havoc all over the Islamic world and here,
Okay, well, Gearóid, I think at this stage in the proceedings, we've probably spoken for too long. It's 10:20. And I'm going, because you've covered so much, it's an awful lot for people to absorb. So I'm going to call it a night with you now, Gearóid. But thank you so much for your time this evening and all of your insights. And I would encourage people to go to Gearóid's website, gearóid.com. Yes, .org.
And there's one thing, somebody contacted me and asked me for the source for the churches, 3 churches, and I couldn't reply. It's the French Ministry of the Interior. If you're watching, it's the French Ministry of Interior. It's their statistics. So
Right. Okay. Well, look, we'll definitely come back to you again, Garrod, as this, we learn a bit more, and I think we certainly haven't heard the last of, well, the media would like us to have heard the last of what actually happened to Notre Dame, but we will continue to ask questions.
Sure.
So thank you very much, Garrod, and a very peaceful Easter to you.
Likewise. Slán.
Slán. So that was Garrod O'Culman, and I know that we had a long conversation tonight. So, and Garrod is such a scholar of everything that is happening within the New World Order at the moment. So his work is well worth reading. But I appreciate you all sticking with us, because I'm sure it was heavy enough. A lot of you have been contacting me in relation to the intense geoengineering that we're seeing over the skies of Ireland at the moment. A lot of you are very worried, frightened. You feel that it's contributing to a lot of the respiratory illnesses which people seem to have at the moment. People are concerned about the fact that the sun just seems to be being kept away from us. And what I'd say to you is, and people are asking me, what can we do about it? And I would say to you, you are right to be worried. This is not in your imagination. You only have to look at some of the images that we've seen from our skies, our own skies and skies around the world, to see that this is not in your imagination. So anyone who tells you that it's in your imagination is brainwashed, and they don't want to see the truth. So, this is going to get worse until we take control of our skies again, and we've got to do that. And that's why I am pleading with you to stop voting for the corrupt parties that are involved in this geoengineering and tolerating it, and who are destroying everything that is good about our country and our food and our water, because they are part of this globalist plan to reduce population. So it is very frightening, very, very frightening times that we live in. We can protest all we want about geoengineering, 5G, etc., and it's very important to do that. But until such time as we get rid of these parties, nothing is going to change. Absolutely nothing is going to change. People are asking me about these ATM removals from towns around the country, and in my opinion, this is about moving towards a cashless society. I mean, for goodness sake, are we expected to believe that people can just go into a town and remove an ATM just like that? I mean, we are just being taken for fools. Garda response always slow. This is another layer of the globalist plan to get rid of cash, because they don't want us to have cash, in the same way they don't want us to drive cars, because they want to take away our freedoms. And I have recently been in Scandinavia, where cashless bars and restaurants and even shops are becoming the norm. We've seen how, for example, in the States, bank accounts belonging to conservatives are being shut down. Absolutely crazy, insane times that we are living in. But watch out for these ATM incidents, because there's usually a bigger picture behind it. I mean, really, that they think that we believe this nonsense that people can just go into a town and that they would be so brazen as to do this. I am not going to go into any detail on the death of the journalist Lara McHugh. I did not know, and I had never heard of. But I will say one thing, that we must, as journalists, always ask questions. That is our job. And we must ask questions from the get-go. And I don't want anyone saying to me, don't ask questions, Gemma, or say nothing, because everyone else can express sympathy and express their condolences. I wonder how genuine that is. If this lady was the journalist that she appears to have been, what she would have wanted more than anything would have been the truth about her death to come out. That is what journalists are supposed to do. So we must ask questions. We must not accept the official narrative as it is spun out. And please, nobody come to me and say, don't ask questions. That's my job. I can't help it. I've got a very curious mind and I can't help it. I'm always going to do my job as a journalist. People are saying to me also, we don't want you to go into politics. We want you to stay as a journalist. And I'm saying to people, I am never going to be anything but a journalist. I've had to make this decision to go to the dark side of politics, but I won't be a politician. I'll always be a journalist. I will always ask questions and I will always seek the truth. And no matter how uncomfortable that might be, I'm going to do it. And that's why I'm hated so much by the establishment, but so be it. But even a couple of my supporters this evening, have said to me, don't maybe ask questions about this one, please don't. And I don't want people to say that they support me. It's not about that. It's about saving our country. It's about getting rid of the corruption and the globalism. It's not about supporting me. You all know at this stage what I stand for and what I want. So if you want that, and if you want to see the change that I want to try and bring about, then support what I'm doing. But I don't want your support of me. I'm really, really grateful for all of your messages. So having said that, and the lovely words that you send, the donations that you have given to Anti-Corruption Ireland, it's just phenomenal. And it does make me want to continue on this path that I am on, and I do intend to continue on it. So I was also today really encouraged by the fact that so many people seem to want to attend Good Friday service, Mass, at 3 o'clock, and from what I'm hearing, the churches were absolutely packed around the country. And this is, of course, what the lunatics who are running the country cannot bear. So be prepared for an awful lot of church bashing, Jesus bashing, Catholic bashing over the next period, because the last thing they want is people reconnecting with the one thing that could make their lives a bit easier, and that is their faith. Because of course their faith will always connect them back to their Irish heritage as well, and they don't want people talking about Irish nationalism, Irish patriotism, and Irish faith. They don't want that. All of that has to be wiped out. So it is great to see that so many Catholics turned up in huge numbers all around the country today to mark the crucifixion of Jesus. So on that note, I'm going to leave you and wish you all a very, very peaceful Easter. And I hope you do get a bit of time away from the craziness all around us. We'll be back fighting hard next week, and I will be beginning my campaign proper to win a seat in Dublin in the European Parliament. So I hope you will all get behind my campaign. But for now, happy Easter and God bless.